The Missouri winter of 1881 hung heavy over the small town of St. Joseph, where snow clung to wooden storefronts like memories that refused to fade. Jesse James pulled his worn coat tighter as he walked down the main street, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. To the townspeople, he was Thomas Howard, a quiet cattle dealer who kept to himself and his young family. "Morning, Mr. Howard," called out Martha Willis from her general store, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Morning, Mrs. Willis," Jesse replied with a tip of his hat, his voice steady despite the weight of deception that had become his daily burden. Inside the modest house on Lafayette Street, Z. James was preparing breakfast for their 2 young children. The aroma of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the small kitchen, creating a warmth that had nothing to do with the wood-burning stove. Jesse watched his wife move gracefully between the stove and table, her brown hair pinned back in a simple style that suited their humble circumstances. "The children are asking about Christmas presents again," Z said softly, not looking up from the pan. "Mary wants a new doll, and Jesse Edward keeps talking about that wooden train set in Willis's store window." Jesse felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten. The money from their last job was running thin, and winter jobs for a supposed cattle dealer were scarce. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the few bills they had left, barely enough for food, let alone Christmas gifts. "We'll make it work, Z. We always do." His wife finally looked up, her blue eyes searching his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read between the lines of survival. "Jesse, I know that look. Don't even think about it." Before he could respond, 4-year-old Jesse Edward burst into the kitchen, his pajamas askew and his hair sticking up in all directions. "Papa, Papa, there's men on horses outside." Jesse's blood turned to ice. Through the frost-covered window, he could see 3 riders approaching slowly, their long coats and purposeful movements unmistakable. Lawmen. Or worse, bounty hunters. "Z, take the children to the back room. Now." His wife didn't argue. Years of running had taught her when Jesse's tone meant immediate danger. She scooped up little Mary and took Jesse Edward's hand, disappearing into the rear of the house. Jesse moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt .45 hidden beneath his coat. The lead rider was tall and lean with a sheriff's badge glinting on his chest. Behind him rode 2 younger men, their hands resting casually on their gun handles. A knock came at the door, firm but not aggressive. "Mr. Howard?" "Sheriff Timberlake. I'd like a word if you don't mind." Jesse took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders. For nearly 2 years he had been Thomas Howard. He had been a father who told bedtime stories and a husband who helped with Sunday dishes. But as he reached for the door handle, he felt Jesse James stirring in his chest like a wild animal that had been caged too long. "Just a moment, Sheriff," he called out, his voice betraying nothing of the storm brewing inside. Through the thin walls, he could hear Z whispering prayers to their children, the same prayers she had whispered during all those nights they had fled from place to place, town to town, always one step ahead of the law, always one step away from the life they desperately wanted to build. Jesse opened the door, meeting the sheriff's steady gaze with practiced calm. But inside, he knew that Thomas Howard's days were numbered, and Jesse James would have to decide whether to run again or make his final stand in the snow-covered streets of St. Joseph, Missouri. The sheriff touched his hat brim. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Mr. Howard?" "Indeed it is, Sheriff. What brings you to my door on such a fine day?" Before we continue, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We always love hearing where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy intense stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us keep going. Thank you so much. Now enjoy the story. Sheriff Timberlake's eyes were the color of winter steel, and they seemed to look right through Jesse's carefully constructed facade. "Mind if we step inside? This Missouri cold has a way of cutting through a man's bones." Jesse stepped aside, allowing the 3 lawmen into his modest home. The warmth of the kitchen felt oppressive now, like the air before a thunderstorm. His children's laughter echoed faintly from the back room, a sound that both comforted and tormented him. "Coffee?" Jesse offered, his hand steady as he reached for the pot on the stove. "Much obliged," the sheriff replied, settling into one of the wooden chairs around the small table. His deputies remained standing, their eyes scanning the room with professional interest. As Jesse poured the coffee, Sheriff Timberlake pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "We've been tracking a man through these parts. Dangerous fellow. Been robbing banks and trains for over a decade." Jesse's hand never wavered as he set the cups down. "Sorry to hear about your troubles, Sheriff. Can't say I've seen anyone suspicious around these parts." "Course not," Timberlake said with a slight smile. Man like that would be good at blending in. Probably seems like the most ordinary fellow you ever did meet. He unfolded the paper, a wanted poster with Jesse's face sketched in bold lines. Rewards up to $10,000 now. $10,000. Jesse knew that amount of money could change a man's life forever in a town like St. Joseph. It could also end one. That's quite a sum, Jesse said, sitting down across from the sheriff. Must be some desperado to command that kind of price. Deputy Williams, the younger of the two men, shifted nervously. Sheriff, maybe we should. Patience, son, Timberlake interrupted, never taking his eyes off Jesse. Mr. Howard here is being mighty helpful. He took a slow sip of his coffee. You know, there's something familiar about you, Mr. Howard. Can't quite place it, but I'd swear we've met before. From the back room came the sound of Mary crying, probably hungry and confused about why they were hiding. Z's gentle voice followed, singing a lullaby that Jesse recognized from his own childhood in Clay County. Your wife has a beautiful voice, the sheriff observed. Southern accent if I'm not mistaken. Like yours. We're from down Arkansas way, Jesse replied. Came north looking for opportunities. Opportunities. Timberlake repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. Funny thing about opportunities, sometimes they come with a price we're not prepared to pay. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jesse could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, but his face remained calm. Years of living with a target on his back had taught him to control his fear, to channel it into something useful. Well, gentlemen, Jesse said, standing up slowly, I appreciate the visit, but I've got cattle business to attend to today. Sheriff Timberlake didn't move. Course you do. Just one more thing, Mr. Howard. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small silver trinket, a compass that Jesse recognized with a shock that nearly knocked him off his feet. It was Frank's compass. His brother Frank had carried it through the war, through every raid, through every escape. Jesse hadn't seen it since they parted ways in Nashville over a year ago. Found this interesting little item on a man we arrested last week in Kansas City, the sheriff continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. Man claimed he got it from a fellow named Frank James. Kept babbling about how his brother was living quiet somewhere in Missouri under a false name. Jesse's mouth went dry. Frank had been captured. His brother, his partner, his closest friend, was in custody, probably facing the gallows. Don't know any Frank James, Jesse managed to say, though his voice came out rougher than intended. Course you don't. Timberlake stood up slowly, his deputies moving closer. But if you did know him, and if you happened to see his brother Jesse, you might tell him that Frank's being held in the Clay County jail. Might also tell him that Frank's been asking for him. Keeps saying he wants to see his brother one more time before. The sheriff let the sentence hang in the air like smoke. Jesse felt the world tilting around him. Frank was alive but captured. The law was closing in. His family was in danger. And somewhere in the back room, his children were waiting for a Christmas that might never come. I'll be sure to pass along the message if I see anyone matching that description, Jesse said quietly. Sheriff Timberlake smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. I'm sure you will, Mr. Howard. I'm sure you will. As the three lawmen prepared to leave, Timberlake paused at the door. Oh, and Mr. Howard? If I were you, I'd be real careful about who I trusted in this town. $10,000 makes men do things they never thought they would. After they left, Jesse stood at the window watching them ride away. Behind him, he heard Z emerge from the back room with the children. Jesse? Her voice was barely a whisper. He turned to face his family, his wife's frightened eyes, his daughter clutching her rag doll, his son looking up at him with complete trust. In that moment, Jesse James realized that Thomas Howard was already dead. The only question now was whether Jesse James would die with him, or whether he would fight one last time to save the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him. Get the children ready, he said quietly. We're leaving St. Joseph tonight. The Missouri night was bitter cold as Jesse loaded their few possessions into the wagon behind their small house. His breath formed crystals in the air as he worked by lamplight, each movement deliberate and efficient, the product of too many midnight escapes over the years. Where will we go this time? Z asked, wrapping Mary in extra blankets while Jesse Edward clung to her skirts, confused by the sudden urgency. South, Jesse replied, securing a trunk with rope. Maybe Texas. Maybe Mexico. But even as he said it, Jesse knew he was lying to himself as much as to his wife. Frank's compass sat heavy in his pocket, a weight that grew heavier with each passing hour. His brother was in a Clay County jail cell, probably counting down the days until his execution. And Jesse James had never left family behind. "Jesse, look at me." He turned to find Z standing in the doorway, her face illuminated by the warm glow from inside their home. Behind her, he could see the kitchen table where they'd shared 1,000 meals, the chair where he'd held his children while they fought off fevers, the window where he'd watched them play in the yard during happier times. "You're thinking about Frank?" she said. It wasn't a question. "He's my brother Z. And we're your family." Her voice cracked slightly. "These children need their father alive, not martyred for a lost cause." Jesse set down the bag he was holding and walked to her. Even in the moonlight, he could see the fear in her eyes, not fear of poverty or hardship, but fear of losing him. They had been through so much together, survived so much. But this felt different. Final. What kind of man abandons his brother to hang while he runs away to safety? "The kind of man who thinks about his wife and children first," Z replied fiercely. "The kind of man who realizes that some fights can't be won." From inside the house came the sound of Jesse Edward crying, tired, confused, and frightened by the disruption to his small world. Jesse closed his eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him like stones. "Papa?" Mary's small voice called from the doorway. "Are we going on another adventure?" Jesse knelt down and gathered his daughter into his arms. At 3 years old, she had already lived in more places than most adults. She had learned to pack quickly, to stay quiet when strangers came to the door, to call her father by different names depending on where they were living. "That's right, sweetheart. Another adventure." Mary smiled and hugged his neck with the trusting affection that only a child could give. Over her shoulder, Jesse saw Z watching him with eyes that had learned to read his heart better than he could himself. As he held his daughter, Jesse made a decision that would change everything. "Z, take the children to your sister's place in Kansas. Wait for me there." "Jesse, no. Listen to me." His voice was firm but not harsh. "I can't run anymore. Not with Frank in that jail cell. Not with the law closing in on every side. But I won't take you and the children down with me." Z was crying now, silent tears that froze on her cheeks in the cold air. "They'll kill you, Jesse. You know they will." "Maybe. But if I don't try, Frank dies for certain. And if we all run together, we'll be caught within a week. They're too close now." Jesse Edward appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and looking lost. Jesse set Mary down and gathered both children to him, memorizing the feel of their small bodies against his chest, the sound of their breathing, the way Mary's hair curled against her neck. "I want you both to be good for your mama," he said quietly. "Mind what she tells you, and remember that your papa loves you more than all the stars in the sky. When will you come back?" Jesse Edward asked with the directness that children possess. Jesse looked up at Z over their son's head. In her eyes, he saw the same question, along with the terrible understanding that this might be goodbye forever. "Soon as I can, son. Soon as I can." 2 hours later, Jesse stood alone in the abandoned house, watching through the window as his family's wagon disappeared into the darkness. The silence was deafening after months of children's laughter and Z's gentle humming. The cold seemed to seep into his bones, settling there like a permanent ache. He walked through the empty rooms one last time, touching the walls that had sheltered them, the floors where his children had taken their first steps, the bed where he had held Z during thunderstorms and fever dreams. This had been the closest thing to peace he had ever known. In the bedroom, he opened the wooden chest where he kept his real weapons, not the simple Colt he carried as Thomas Howard, but the matched pair of .44 caliber Colt Navy revolvers that had been his companions since the war. Their weight felt familiar in his hands, like greeting old friends after a long absence. Jesse James was preparing for his last ride, and he knew it would be alone. As dawn approached, he saddled his horse and rode out of St. Joseph toward Clay County, toward his brother, toward a reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. Behind him, the house where Thomas Howard had tried to build a life sat empty and cold, already becoming another ghost story in a life filled with them. The morning sun painted the Missouri landscape in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and terrible and final. Jesse James was going home one last time and he was going to war. Clay County in December was a landscape painted in stark whites and deep grays, where bare trees stood like sentinels against the winter sky. Jesse rode his horse hard through terrain he had known since childhood, every hill and stream marking his journey back to a past he could never fully escape. The jail in Liberty was a squat stone building that looked more like a fortress than a place of justice. Jesse studied it from a ridge overlooking the town, noting the guards, the entrances, the patterns of movement. It was a fool's errand, he knew, one man against an entire town. But Frank was in there and that was enough. As the sun reached its peak, Jesse spotted Sheriff Coleman making his rounds, the same man who had been hunting the James brothers since the end of the war. Behind him walked Deputy Morrison, young and eager, his hand never far from his weapon. Jesse had two choices: try to break Frank out in a blaze of gunfire that would likely get them both killed, or turn himself in and hope they would allow the brothers to see each other one last time. Either way, Thomas Howard was about to disappear forever. He rode down into Liberty just after noon, when the streets were busy with people going about their daily business. A few heads turned as he passed. Something about him commanded attention even when he was trying to blend in. Perhaps it was the way he sat his horse, or the careful way his eyes studied everything around him. Jesse dismounted in front of the jail and tied his horse to the hitching post. His hands were steady as he checked his weapons one last time, though his heart was pounding like a war drum. Through the small barred window, he thought he could see movement, a shadow that might have been Frank. The door opened before he could knock. "Jesse James," Sheriff Coleman said simply, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. "You're either the bravest man in Missouri or the biggest fool." "Maybe both, Sheriff." Coleman was older now, his hair gone gray and his face lined with the weight of years spent chasing outlaws across the frontier. But his eyes were still sharp, still dangerous. "You here to surrender, or are you planning to shoot up my town?" "I'm here to see my brother." "Your brother's going to hang in 3 days' time. Nothing you can do will change that." Jesse felt something break inside his chest, but his voice remained steady. "I know. I just want to see him." Coleman studied him for a long moment, perhaps recognizing something in Jesse's face that spoke of finality and acceptance. "You'll have to surrender your weapons." Jesse nodded and slowly drew his revolvers, holding them by the barrels as he handed them over. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of the matched Colts, weapons of such quality and craftsmanship that they were almost works of art. "These are beautiful pieces," Coleman said with grudging admiration. "They've served me well." Inside the jail, the sound of Jesse's boots echoed off stone walls as Coleman led him past empty cells toward the back of the building. In the final cell, Frank James sat on a narrow cot, his head in his hands. He looked up at the sound of footsteps, and his face transformed with an emotion too complex for words. "Dingus," Frank said, using the childhood nickname that only family knew. "You damned fool." Jesse gripped the iron bars, his knuckles white with tension. "Buck." The brothers looked at each other through the bars. Jesse still free but knowing his freedom was measured in minutes, Frank condemned but somehow at peace. They had ridden together through war and outlawry, through triumph and disaster, and now they would face the end together. "How are Z and the children?" Frank asked. "Safe. On their way to Kansas." Frank nodded, relief evident in his features. "Good. That's good, Dingus." Sheriff Coleman unlocked the cell door. 5 minutes, he said gruffly. "Then Mr. Jesse James joins you permanently." As the door clanged shut behind Jesse, the brothers embraced, the first time they had touched in over a year. Frank felt thinner, older, worn down by captivity and the knowledge of his approaching fate. "You shouldn't have come," Frank said quietly. "Couldn't leave you to face this alone. And now we both die and Z becomes a widow with 2 children to raise." Frank's voice carried a weight of regret but no anger. "Was that the right choice, brother?" Jesse sat down on the cot beside Frank, feeling the cold seep through the stone walls. Outside, he could hear the sounds of Liberty going about its business. Horses in the street, children playing, life continuing as it always did. "I don't know," Jesse admitted. "Maybe not. But I couldn't live with myself if I'd run." Frank was quiet for a long moment. "Do you remember when we were boys and Pa used to take us fishing down at Shoal Creek?" "I remember. He used to say that a man's worth wasn't measured by how long he lived, but by how he chose to face the end." Frank looked at his brother with eyes that held no fear. "I think we've faced it as well as any men could." Through the small window, the winter sun was beginning to set, painting the cell in shades of gold and orange. Soon it would be dark and tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow would bring. "I love you, Buck," Jesse said simply. "I love you too, Dingus." They sat together in the growing darkness, 2 brothers who had chosen their path long ago and followed it to its inevitable conclusion. Outside, Sheriff Coleman was probably arranging for the telegram that would bring federal marshals and newspaper reporters and curious spectators to witness the end of the James gang. But inside the cell there was only family, and the quiet understanding that some bonds are stronger than bars or bullets or even death itself. As night fell over Clay County, Jesse James closed his eyes and thought of Z's smile, of his children's laughter, of all the ordinary moments he had cherished as Thomas Howard. Those memories would have to be enough now. The outlaw's trail had finally reached its end, but the man's love would endure long after the legend had turned to dust. The last stand of Jesse James wasn't fought with guns and glory, but with the simple choice to stand beside his brother when standing meant everything and nothing at all.